Today's guest is Chuck Grindle. He's the executive advisor for public sector at Proofpoint. And Chuck is an Army veteran. Thank you for your service. Thank you for all the years of service, quite a few. And I think he's also a previous chief information officer. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more about the decisions and how those things came about. So Chuck, thank you for coming on the podcast today.
Well, Jeremy, thank you. And thank you also for your service. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk with other veterans.
So for those who haven't met you or had a drink or hung out at an event with you, talk about where you're from, who you are, and what you do.
Yeah, sure. So I'm originally from Greensburg, Pennsylvania, which is kind of southwest of the city proper, and grew up in the region. Went to high school. I was a football player. I was an inside linebacker. Inside linebacker actually took me to W&J, Washington and Jefferson College, where I played Division III ball. I got an early start in computers because a friend of mine's dad worked at St. Vincent's College in the computer science department. Brought home this Apple IIc that really intrigued me, the little green screen, and was able to develop a program, tic-tac-toe, on that using Apple Basic. And it really caused me to kind of think about, hey, I can make this thing do things, right? St. Vincent's is really important if you're a Steelers fan because that's where training camp is. So it was all good, right? Football, computers, that seemed to be good for me. So I went to W&J undergrad and played football there. Unfortunately, life events. My father worked for a company that was affected by the steel mills and during that time frame, and lost his job early on. W&J was a private college, very expensive, and I needed to look for ways to kind of take care of the financial portion without moving on. A friend of mine's dad owned a refuse company where I had been working there since I was 13. And so they agreed to allow me to work. It was about an hour away. So I aligned my classes so that I could have them from 8 till noon in the morning when I wasn't in football season. Drove an hour back, worked from 1 until 9, and then came back to W&J. Now, obviously, I also needed more help than that. So I pursued getting an ROTC scholarship, and the Army was available at that time, and I was in fairly good condition, so I could pass a PT test and kind of the wherewithal. So I started down the journey of ROTC. And really, at that point, I didn't really think that, from my perspective, that I would end up going into the military. But I did well at advanced camp. And then given that, I was branched active duty into the artillery. So from that standpoint, I immediately went to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where I had my initial encounter with an individual by the name of Matt Bevan. I will explain why that's important. We were both lieutenants at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and then we both got stationed at Fort Polk, Louisiana. Lieutenant Bevan, Matt Bevan, ultimately ended up getting out and then ultimately ran for governor in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. I ended up staying in, and Matt paid attention to my military career. And when the time was right, and he ended up becoming governor, he ended up asking me to be his CIO. Now, that's a lot of time in between that.
Right.
But during that time frame, I was an artillery officer at Fort Hood, Texas. I then had an opportunity to go back and get my master's. My boss at the time, a guy by the name of Colonel Valcourt, said, look, you could go to the National Training Center and be an observer controller, or you can do this thing like going to get a master's. He's like, I really think that you need to go to the National Training Center and continue to be an artillery officer. And I said, well, sir, I had this full ride. And so he agreed to sign the paperwork to allow me to go. So I went to Pitt. I was able to get in-state tuition to go to Pitt, which the Army paid for. And then my first utilization tour was at the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. The reason why that's really significant is the War College had what was called the Center for Strategic Leadership, and we did strategic wargaming and conferencing. And I was able to run their IT group for that group. And notably, that was during 9/11. Well, we were Site Zulu to the Pentagon. So when the Pentagon got hit, we then were in a position to accept those individuals that were displaced from the Pentagon. And I'm a major at that point in my career, and that was really impactful to me. What we were able to do from an IT perspective. My boss, Professor Campbell, said to me, he's like, "Look, Chuck," he said, "you're in a position where you can go back and get your doctorate degree in IT." He's like, "I think you ought to do that." Now, I asked him if he had bumped his head because I just came out of a master's program. And I'm like, "Sir, do I really?" He's like, "Look, trust me." Well, so I went back, I got accepted, went back to do my doctorate degree. But unfortunately, we ended up starting a war in 2003. And so I was there for a couple of years and I was pulled out to go downrange into Southwest Asia to be General Wickham's CI, really his IT guy responsible for that for Third Army and Camp Arif John, Kuwait. And so I spent a year doing that. We did a lot of very interesting things. And I was able to come back then to the War College to be the deputy CIO. I really wanted to write my dissertation, but unfortunately, I wasn't in a position where I was teaching, so I didn't have the time. It was an operational role. And then I got selected to attend the War College, and I thought, okay, then I get to be able to stay at the War College. No, no, no. The Army has, you got to go and do a utilization tour, right? So I went to West Point then and was the CIO at West Point. And then about 2 years into that, or a year and a half, my former boss, the deputy commandant, called me and said, "Look, I can get you back to teach at the War College, but you have 2 years to complete your dissertation." I'm like, I haven't been in a position, an education position for nearly 7 years. And he said to me, he's like, "Chuck, it's binary, yes or no." So I came back to the War College 2 years and 9 days later, wrote my dissertation, defended it, and so I was teaching at the War College at the time when Governor Bevin asked me to be his CIO in Kentucky. My wife said to me at the time, we were coming back from the inauguration, the girls and I are staying here in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. If you want to go be CIO, you need to drive back and forth. And so that was an agreement that I had always made to my wife to keep the kids, the girls in one place. And so I did. I drove back and forth every week during that time frame. It was a very important time frame, I think, for Governor Bevin and for me personally because of the size of the organization and all the people, the executive directors that worked with me during that time frame and the things we were able to get accomplished. Notably, a lot of folks took notice to that. And so after the election, which had consequences, right? We lost, unfortunately. Several organizations had asked me to join. And so I joined AWS. And then that ultimately led me, I had implemented Proofpoint in Kentucky, and the Proofpoint team asked me to join their team to be an executive advisor. And that's really where I am right now. So that's really kind of how my career was kind of cultivated across, different sectors.
So since you were already you've been a CIO prior, and you of course teaching at the War College, how was that transition from being a green suit to a civilian life?
For me, fortunately, federal government and state government are a lot alike, right? Budget cycles, strict requirements for RFPs and purchasing, et cetera. I think the one thing that really helped me was that nature of being very strict about the way in which you conducted business, and then the credibility that was brought with it by serving in the federal government and being able to, meet some of the stringent requirements for different organizations. The fact that I had a leader that I worked for in Governor Bevin that pretty much said to me, "Hey, look, Chuck, security is your number one priority. Keep our organization off the front page of the Washington Post." That kind of, turns up the volume a little bit. And so it's really then going into the organization. And because I taught strategy at the War College, working with the team to put in a strategic plan. I will tell you, in my desk, there were several strategic plans that had been developed, but not enacted, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so for me and the team, to be able to sit down and go through what were going to be our lines of effort, and then what did they want to focus on for their particular role. So what were their action plans that would support the strategic plan that we could then put into a project plan, and knew the resources, knew the funding, knew the timeline. Well, I'll tell you, that was for me, you look at commanding, that was really to me a capstone exercise for everything that I had learned up to that point about IT, and then being able to do it across a large organization. I mean, we had 2,400 applications. Some are public facing, some are internal, but being able to put that across the entire continuum with the mindset of security first, right? And then being able to service the citizens to make sure that the things we were doing were actually servicing the citizens ultimately and being value added. It was a lot of fun.
I can imagine. I mean, I've been around the block in the federal space, and I know a lot of friends in federal space, and that is one of the challenges is IT can create all kinds of strategic plans. It's easy to create a strategic plan. It's much, much harder to execute on that plan in any degree, right? Or to create a realistic plan that is executable. I think people lose sight of that sometimes when they're pulling those plans together. They make them very stretch, and then you go, it's great that we have that, but if it's not achievable, there is a morale cost to that and an operational cost to that. So it's great to hear that Kentucky was able to, and at Kentucky you were able to do that. So that's a big plus.
It was I tell you, I've been out of position, since 2019 in Kentucky, and still have the opportunity to speak with a lot of my executive directors from that time frame. And they still, the exercise that we went through and their continuation of doing that has been a highlight for them in their career, because they really know what to do now, right? They understand that. And the individual that replaced me is a CPA. And so while from a budget perspective, that's great, from the core IT stuff,
Yeah.
that there isn't that there. So they have to rely on what they know. And several have said that going through that process was really inspirational to them. So I appreciate those comments.
Yeah, I would also say any employer who's looking to hire an executive to come in and do something cannot go wrong hiring a former military officer. Well, I mean, the education that they give you, the command opportunities that you have, the schools that you go to be in those positions, they are as good, in my opinion. And I was not an officer, but in my opinion, they're as good as some of the well-known leadership schools outside of the military. So people need to keep that in mind.
Well, and the experiences, right,
Yeah.
that you have, whether you're an officer or enlisted, and I will tell you, I will go to bat for any one of the individuals that I served with, right, because it was my responsibility to make sure they were trained to the appropriate level. And as you probably went in your career, that, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a level of expectation there, because literally it's life and death in some instances. And you want to make sure that that person that's beside you can execute, and they can also carry your backside off the battlefield, right?
That's right. That's right.
Let's face it, your battle buddy, right? So yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right.
So Chuck, when you look back at your career and the opportunities you've had, what's something you might highlight where you say, man, I wish we did that slightly differently. There's an opportunity for maybe an efficiency or a rethink on something that we do. And this could be IT generally, or it could be business generally. And I'm going to caveat it to make sure you don't have to solve that problem today, right? This is an awareness factor where we can maybe just chat about it a little bit. But what's one or even more things when you look back at your career that you think fall into that category?
Yeah, I think first off, I would say from the federal space, we put a lot of emphasis on something called FedRAMP. Um, and I think sometimes, to be honest with you, it's a cop out. And and I know that there are vendors out there that are not meeting certain requirements and cutting corners. And I understand FedRAMP is kind of in that place to try to make sure that that happens. But when you look at some companies in the cyberspace that have been in business for, 10, 15, 20 years, they're in that business because they know what the hell they're doing, right?
Right.
And so to then say that you have to meet some other paperwork shuffle, because that's the way I look at it. And look, I'm not going to solve that because of the bureaucracy that's out there, right? I can make recommendations, but that's one thing that I think if we had a restart of that and we took a look at the amount of money that we have spent and the amount of resources that organizations have spent to build this thing called FedRAMP and the rest of it, I think we could be better served by having a different mousetrap.
Hmm.
So that's first the federal government side of it. I think from my perspective in Kentucky, just kind of Kentucky alone, if you look at, I think from if I would have been more forceful in the use of cloud technologies earlier, and really looking at the folks that understood cloud technologies earlier on, I think we as an entity would have been able to move a little bit more briskly later on, in my tenure as CIO. And I think that, I put that onus on me because I think as a leader, you have to give that vision and you have to give that guidance. And I don't think I did that early enough, as an emphasis. And I think that's now there are some states that still aren't, right? That are
Yeah.
really adopting that capability. So I think if I looked at that earlier on in my career and what that meant across different organizations, I think back to the federal government and I had some individuals that said, we're just going to wait that guy out,
Hmm.
right? And that was the mindset, right? Hey, look, every 3 years we change out, right?
Right.
So hey, look, he'll be gone, and we can do that, right? I think there's some of that mindset that um, we really can change, um, and but it takes a different kind of evaluation. It takes a different type of initiative to be able to allow that to happen. And so, you know, self self reflection for me is if I would have done it earlier in my career when it comes to cloud, I think we would have been better positioned for other things.
I think that's an interesting point because there are federal agencies that are still not fully cloud or even close to fully cloud. I won't name names. I don't want to get anybody in trouble, but it is not an uncommon problem. And even at state and local, right, as you mentioned, there's still a lot of challenges there. I think um, understanding the technology is huge if you have a workforce who's been there a long time and
Hmm.
hasn't adjusted to the change. I think this is the fear we have for AI in the coming years, is that the workforce won't adjust to the change of AI and its capability. And the same thing I think came I've been in IT a long time. I was a system engineer, then a software engineer, and change is hard. And wanting to move away from one technology that you know is solid and has done the job and continues to do the job and move to another, it's it's hard sometimes to get that change to come across. So I could totally see that, and I could see, yeah, but yeah, I also agree with you. Adopting cloud earlier, even at places I've been, if we adopted cloud earlier, the potential things that could have been done because of the adoption would have, been much earlier realized, and could have made mission much easier in some ways.
Well, and it's a people problem, right?
Yeah.
I mean, let's face it. You and I have both grown up in a time frame. Hey, look, I know COBOL. I can program in COBOL, and and let's think back to that, that time frame, and now all of a sudden we're doing it differently, right?
Yeah.
And it's a people-centric problem. So how do we then look at adjusting those individuals? And it's more than just one set, right?
Right.
Because it's got to be across the board, and there are different things that certain people need to learn. And then it's the collective effort then coming back together, right? And saying, hey, look, this is an initiative we're going to take on. So yeah, it's hindsight, right?
Right, hindsight. And then you raise an interesting point about FedRAMP. I do know federal agencies that have foregone FedRAMP. They're using commercial services that are, have gone through an evaluation to say they met the need, they've met the mark, they met the rules, right? They've met the NIST control set, that FedRAMP, and without that FedRAMP aspect of it. So it is completely possible. And I know many CISOs who struggle with that decision, because there is this FedRAMP hammer that is waved around at the agencies, but yet there are solutions that can move organizations forward that aren't FedRAMP, and but yet are can be proven to be secure. So that's a tough one. I mean, I know GSA has all the best intentions in mind with the concept of the FedRAMP program, and I know they're constantly improving that program. But I get what you're saying, and the cost to become FedRAMP certified for especially small businesses is so cost
Mhm.
prohibitive. Yeah, there's something that needs to be rethought there.
Well, and I think the defining moment for me, the indicating that maybe this mousetrap that we built called FedRAMP is really has gone beyond really what we originally thought it would, was when we now have state ramp, and now we have AZ ramp, Arizona ramp, and we have Tex ramp, and and so what's next? Is every state going to have their own accrediting body, right? And so then that that tells me then, okay, so why is it that those organizations are standing up? Well, state ramp says that, well, it's much easier to do state ramp and there's less requirements and we can do it more quickly. Okay, so there's a nimbleness, right, of state ramp. Okay, so why is it the FedRAMP can't be more nimble? Why is it that it's taking, and I don't want to throw a number out because I don't know anymore, but state ramp says they can do it much more quickly. And so, and then you have Tex ramp. Well, you can't buy anything in Texas for the Texas folks unless you're on Tex ramp or you're on FedRAMP. Okay.
Right.
So, but we can, company I work for right now, 87 of the Fortune 100 companies use our products, which aren't necessarily FedRAMP. So why is that? And they fall into the same rigid compliance when you're talking about Wall Street and all the compliance needs of trading companies, et cetera, and banks. They have the same stringent requirements. Why are they okay with using our products, right? And yet they don't meet the FedRAMP or TexRAMP requirements. It just, those are the types of things that in our industry that kind of drive you nuts a little bit, right?
They can indeed. They can indeed. It's like saying every software developer needs to do CMMI. You don't hear about it anymore, but man, for a while, that's all you ever heard was CMMI.
Well, it's CMMC, right? Or
Oh,
something like that now, right?
Yeah. So
Okay.
it's always something, right? It's always some requirement, which I agree. I think your main underlining point is a checkbox effort, a paperwork drill, right? A way
Mhm.
of filtering out so I don't have so many proposals to read.
Right.
And when it becomes that, I agree with you. It becomes counterproductive to getting the mission accomplished.
Exactly. And and that first thing I ask is, okay, let's look at the background. Was this company hacked? Right? Hey, over the past, 10, 15 years, how many times have they been, you know, had a problem? And I will tell you, I applaud what has happened, and I think it's the SEC or the FC, whoever has required publicly traded organizations, and I think that's the SEC, to report within 48 hours if they've had a breach, right? I applaud that, right?
Yeah.
Now, I don't necessarily like some organizations that have kind of said, okay, well, we're just going to give a little bit of information right now, and then a week from now we'll give a little bit more, and then in another week you give a little bit more, right? But I applaud that effort. And the reason why is I think there is accountability, right? That needs to happen. I also believe that those organizations have to, there's acceptable risk.
Mm,
And I think some of those organizations are taking risk that's not necessarily acceptable, or at least would not be to you or I.
right.
And so the question is, what is acceptable risk? Um, and, it seems as though, depending on who you talk to, there's a level of acceptable risk.
Depends on the CISO, right? Depends on the CISO in charge and their level of knowledge, maybe their experience and things that have gone
Mhm.
wrong for them in the past, right? Or organizations they
Sure.
worked at. Yeah, it's variable, which is tough on companies who are trying to sell into that environment where you have a variety of opinions that are driving the level of
Yep.
risk
Agreed.
rather than some sort of logical methodology that can be understood.
Right.
So what's coming up here for you here in the near future, Chuck? Any things that you do outside of Proofpoint or any other things going on that would be of interest?
Well, so from my standpoint, I'm a golfer, and my daughter's a
Ah,
golfer. So personally, I mean, golfing is really important to me, and um, we also we are Corvette people. So my father-in-law, when he passed away, willed us several Corvettes. So we're maintaining about 9 Corvettes right
ah,
now. So that's kind of on the fun side. But I think, outside of that, I do a bunch of assistance with uh, my daughters went to a school, St. Pat's Catholic school. We do some help there. I help an organization by the name of Volunteers of America, and so we do some help with that organization and their kind of their IT needs and advising. I think it's really interesting the and I say rhetoric, tongue in cheek, but you know AI. And we can't go a conversation right without having AI in the discussion. But if you look at states and local governments, um, about really what's important there, and you ultimately get down to something called generative AI, and then you say to yourself, right, what does that really mean for a state or local government? I mean, it goes to the point of the data, right, that an organization holds. And I found it really interesting when one particular organization that will be nameless found out that some of their folks were using, a form of AI to do some of their responses.
mm,
And then they found out that the data that they were, working with or that they were uploading was going into this commercial site that they didn't have control of. And, that caused them to kind of stop. So really, from my perspective, it's really helping folks understand what really AI AI means to their organization. Um, and for a second, I'll talk about Proofpoint. We acquired a company called Tessian, which does heuristic-based email. So it takes a look at the behaviors I have when communicating with folks. And so if there's something that seems to be out of the ordinary, it basically prompts me and says, "Hey, Chuck, did you really, anticipate sending this document to Jeremy, right? Because Jeremy would, because really this document goes to Jeremy X normally, and that's a really,
Mm.
helpful tool because I can tell you as being a CIO, I've had that dreaded phone call from an organization that said, "Hey, Chuck, I just sent this email. How do I get it back?" Right?
Right.
And that's a really, for that person, it's a really interesting conversation when you talk to them and say, "Hey, when you send something like that into the ether, it's gone," right?
Yeah.
And people don't realize that. And that's why people-centric security, if we can train folks, right, and have them understand and then have helper apps that cause them from those faux pas, I think that's really important. So those are the types of things I'm really interested in working on right now because I think that when you look at the end of the day, we really need to up our game with the people that we work with. And I'll use my household as an example. My mother-in-law lives with us right now. And so, I've kind of said, "Hey, look, you know, her name's Joanne, but we call her Ma." And I've said, "Look, Ma, if you get somebody that calls you and says, 'Hey, look, they want to have access to your computer or your iPad,' I said, 'Come on up, come on, let's have a conversation with that individual, right?'" And so it's really interesting how the threats are preying on the elderly, preying on my kids, my daughters, preying on my wife with social engineering. And we Proofpoint have taken a personal interest in that. And me personally, I've taken an interest in that to help protect my family. So that's what Chuck Grindle is doing right now and trying to understand that.
Well, Chuck, I love it. I think those are very important things to pay attention to. And I want to just thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been very interesting to hear your story, to hear what drives you, to hear what interests you, and I really can't wait to see where that goes for you.
I appreciate that. And thank you for the invite. And again, thank you for your service.